Listen carefully, because what I'm about to share with you could save your sanity. If you've ever felt like someone was slowly stealing pieces of your soul, making you question your own reality while they smiled and acted like the victim, you need to hear this. Carl Jung discovered something so powerful about narcissistic manipulation that once you understand it, you'll never be their target again. But I have to warn you, what Jung uncovered about the human psyche is both liberating and terrifying, because it will show you exactly how they've been feeding off your pain. And more importantly, how one simple sentence can make them retreat in fear forever. If you're watching this, you've probably experienced the confusion, the gaslighting, the emotional roller coaster that leaves you wondering if you're the crazy one. And according to Carl Jung, you're not losing your mind. You're being psychologically hunted by someone who sees your empathy as their personal feeding ground. But here's what Jung discovered that will change everything you thought you knew about dealing with these people. Jung spent decades studying the darkest corners of human behavior, and what he found about narcissistic manipulation will shock you. Jung discovered that narcissists don't actually fear confrontation, anger, or even being exposed. What they fear most is something far more devastating: psychological irrelevance. Jung observed that narcissists operate from what he called desperate psychological dependency. They cannot survive without what he termed emotional supply. Your reactions, your explanations, your desperate attempts to make them understand. According to Jung, this isn't about love or connection. It's about psychological vampirism. They literally feed off your emotional energy to avoid facing their own inner emptiness. But here's Jung's most disturbing insight. Narcissists can sense empathetic people from across a room like predators detecting wounded prey. Jung realized that they target individuals with high emotional intelligence, not because they're easier to manipulate, but because empathetic people provide the richest psychological nourishment. They need your emotional reactions to maintain their inflated sense of self. Jung called this phenomenon shadow projection. The narcissist projects their own inner chaos, shame, and emptiness onto you, then feeds off your attempts to prove them wrong. Every time you defend yourself, explain your position, or try to make them see reason, you're actually giving them exactly what they need to survive psychologically. And this is why traditional approaches to dealing with narcissists fail so miserably. Most people try to fight narcissists with logic, with emotional appeals, or by setting conventional boundaries. But Jung discovered something revolutionary. These approaches actually strengthen the narcissist's psychological hold over you, because they provide the emotional engagement the narcissist craves. You're unknowingly participating in your own psychological destruction. Now, Jung's research gets even more disturbing because he uncovered exactly how narcissists create what he called emotional supply chains. Sophisticated psychological systems designed to keep you trapped in cycles of confusion and reaction. Jung observed that narcissists are like emotional drug addicts, and your reactions are their drug of choice. According to Jung, narcissists need your unconscious participation in their distorted reality to maintain their psychological balance. They create drama, confusion, and chaos, not because they enjoy conflict, but because your emotional responses to these situations feed their desperate need for validation. Jung discovered that without this constant emotional supply, narcissists experience what he termed ego collapse anxiety, a terrifying confrontation with their authentic wounded self. This is why they're so skilled at pushing your buttons. Jung realized that narcissists spend enormous amounts of mental energy studying your emotional patterns, your triggers, your vulnerabilities. They become experts in your psychology, not out of love or interest, but out of survival necessity. They need to know exactly how to provoke the emotional reactions that keep them psychologically afloat. Jung observed something even more sinister. Narcissists create what he called circular psychological entanglement. Conversations that go nowhere, arguments that have no resolution, emotional situations that drain your energy while providing them with the psychological nourishment they crave. You think you're trying to resolve conflicts, but according to Jung, you're actually participating in their feeding ritual. But here's where Jung's discovery becomes truly revolutionary. He found that narcissists have one fatal psychological weakness. They cannot manipulate what they cannot emotionally engage. Jung discovered that their entire manipulation system depends on your unconscious participation in their psychological drama. And the moment you withdraw that participation, their power structure begins to crumble. This is why traditional boundaries often fail with narcissists. Jung realized that saying things like, "Don't talk to me that way," or "You're being unreasonable," actually provides them with opportunities for further manipulation. They can argue with your boundaries, question your reasoning, or twist your words to create more emotional engagement. But Jung discovered one approach that completely disrupts their psychological feeding system. After years of studying narcissistic behavior, Jung identified one response that narcissists cannot psychologically handle, because it offers them absolutely nothing to feed on. This sentence doesn't attack their ego, so they can't play victim. It doesn't explain your reasoning, so they can't create confusion. And it doesn't engage with their manipulation, so they can't escalate the drama. Are you ready to hear the sentence that Jung discovered can make any narcissist retreat in psychological terror? The phrase is, "I'm not available for this conversation." Jung found this sentence devastating to narcissists because it denies them what they need most, your emotional participation in their reality distortion. When you say, "I'm not available for this conversation," you're not arguing with their logic, you're not defending your position, and you're not trying to make them understand your perspective. You're simply withdrawing your psychic energy from their manipulation. According to Jung, this phrase works because it's what he called psychologically complete. It requires no explanation, offers no points for argument, and provides no emotional energy for the narcissist to consume. Jung observed that narcissists are trained to handle anger, defensiveness, and even silence. But they have no psychological tools to manipulate someone who simply declares their unavailability. But here's what makes this sentence truly powerful. Jung discovered that it forces narcissists to confront their deepest fear, psychological abandonment. When you consistently respond with, "I'm not available for this conversation," you're essentially telling them that their manipulation tactics have no power over your internal reality. You're psychologically unavailable for their drama. Jung noted something fascinating about this phrase. It cannot be argued with, manipulated, or twisted. It's not an attack on their ego, so they can't play victim. It's not an explanation, so they can't create confusion. It's simply a boundary. And Jung discovered that healthy boundaries are kryptonite to narcissistic manipulation. But Jung discovered something crucial that you need to understand about using this approach. Narcissists will escalate their behavior before they retreat. Jung called this phenomenon extinction, burst, intensification. When narcissists realize their usual manipulation tactics aren't working, they temporarily increase the intensity of their psychological attacks. According to Jung, this escalation happens because you've disrupted what he termed their psychological homeostasis, the balance of power they need to maintain their false self. When you refuse to engage with their manipulation, they experience what Jung called ego deflation anxiety, the terrifying possibility of having to face their authentic, wounded self without the distraction of manipulating you. Jung observed that during this escalation phase, narcissists may try several desperate tactics. They might accuse you of being cold, emotionally unavailable, or cruel. They might escalate their own emotional displays, hoping to trigger your empathy. They might even threaten to leave or harm themselves. in attempts to regain your psychological participation. Jung says these are all signs that your boundary is working. But here's what Jung discovered that will give you strength during this difficult phase. The intensity of their reaction is directly proportional to how effectively you've withdrawn your psychological participation. The more desperately they escalate, the more clearly it proves that you've found their psychological weakness, their complete dependence on your emotional reactions. Jung provided specific guidance for this phase. He said you must maintain what he called conscious non-participation, regardless of how they escalate. Every time you respond with, "I'm not available for this conversation," and then disengage, you reinforce your psychological independence. Jung observed that narcissists eventually realize they cannot penetrate this boundary. According to Jung, consistency is everything during this phase. Narcissists are testing whether you'll return to your old patterns of emotional engagement. They're hoping that if they escalate enough, you'll go back to defending, explaining, or trying to make them understand. But Jung discovered that if you maintain your boundary consistently, they're forced to find other sources of psychological supply. Now here's where Jung's discovery becomes truly life-changing. Because he found that consistently maintaining this boundary doesn't just protect you from one narcissist, it fundamentally transforms your entire psychological relationship with manipulation. Jung called this process psychological individuation in the face of toxicity. According to Jung, when you master the art of conscious non-participation, you develop what he termed manipulation immunity. You become someone who cannot be psychologically hooked by projection, gaslighting, or emotional manipulation. Jung observed that people who achieve this level of psychological development become what narcissists fear most: unavailable targets. Jung discovered that this transformation happens gradually. Each time you respond with, "I'm not available for this conversation," instead of engaging with manipulation, you strengthen what he called your conscious ego, your authentic sense of self that cannot be fractured by another person's unconscious projections. You're literally rewiring your psychological responses to manipulation. But Jung observed something even more profound. This sentence doesn't just change how narcissists interact with you. It changes how you see yourself. Every time you honor your own psychological boundaries, you reclaim what Jung called your authentic psychological authority. You stop being someone who can be manipulated, confused, or controlled by others. According to Jung, people who master this boundary develop conscious recognition, the ability to spot projection, manipulation, and psychological games before they can take hold. You begin to see narcissistic behavior clearly without being emotionally hijacked by it. Jung said this is the highest form of psychological protection because it's based on inner strength rather than external defenses. Jung noted that this transformation creates a fascinating phenomenon. Narcissists begin to avoid you altogether because they can sense that you're no longer psychologically available for their manipulation. They can feel that you've become someone who cannot provide them with the emotional supply they need to maintain their inflated ego. Jung called this becoming energetically incompatible with narcissistic manipulation. Carl Jung's ultimate insight about dealing with narcissistic manipulation reveals a profound truth about human psychology. You don't need to outsmart, expose, or defeat a narcissist. You simply need to become psychologically unavailable for their manipulation, and that unavailability terrifies them more than any confrontation ever could. Jung discovered that true psychological freedom comes not from changing others, but from becoming immune to their unconscious projections. When you master the phrase, "I'm not available for this conversation," and the conscious non-participation it represents, you transcend narcissistic manipulation entirely. You're no longer fighting against their behavior, you're simply existing beyond their psychological reach. According to Jung, this is how genuine healing happens. Not through understanding why narcissists behave the way they do, but through reclaiming your own psychological sovereignty. One boundary, one sentence, one moment of conscious choice at a time. Jung observed that the narcissist's greatest weapon, their ability to create emotional chaos, becomes completely powerless against someone who refuses to participate in their psychological drama. Jung's wisdom reveals the ultimate paradox of dealing with toxic people. The moment you stop trying to make them fear you, they begin to fear your unshakable peace. Not your anger, but your conscious silence. Not your reactions, but your absolute refusal to engage with their distorted reality. Jung said that this kind of psychological independence is what makes narcissists truly afraid, because it exposes the emptiness of their manipulation. The transformation Jung described isn't just about protecting yourself from one toxic person. It's about becoming someone who attracts healthy relationships while naturally repelling manipulative ones. You develop what Jung called psychological magnetism for authenticity and automatic immunity to psychological manipulation. This is Jung's final insight about this journey. Every time you choose conscious non-participation over unconscious reaction, you're not just changing your relationship with one narcissist, you're changing your entire relationship with your own power. You're declaring that your psychological energy is precious, and you'll no longer give it away to people who use it to avoid facing their own shadow. If you found value in what we shared today, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue creating content that can genuinely help people reclaim their psychological freedom. Remember, true strength lies not in fighting manipulation, but in becoming psychologically unavailable for it. When you truly grasp this principle, you've already won. Not because you've defeated anyone, but because you've reclaimed the most important relationship of all, the one you have with your own authentic self.